Alright guys, Bill here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another video where I run through Survivor history, where in the past I had already done a video where I talk about my favorite episodes from every season. However, here I'll be doing the inverse in talking about my least favorite episodes from every season. So I'll be running through History Show, going season by season, talking about what episode I think is the worst of the bunch. Essentially the episode that I would rather rewatch the least. Obviously, just a lot of them can just be straight up boring with not much going on, though there can also be other circumstances that lower my assessment of them. But with that, let's just jump right into it. Let's start off with season 1, the worst episode of this season. I think does come from the pre-merge. Even though Borneo is obviously known for having the first ever Pagonging, I don't feel like that Pagonging is boring. I feel like all the post-merge episodes are pretty strong, but I do think it is episodes 3, 4, and 5 that are probably the weakest of the bunch. Or here I decided to go with episode 4, Too Little Too Late, the episode where Ramona gets voted out, mainly because I didn't feel like anything of substance really happened in this episode. I felt like these other episodes had more iconic, like, individual moments within them. This episode just felt kind of baseline, while also having Ramona go home, who, again, was sick and was just kind of a predictable boot there. Yeah, at the end of the day, it's still not an entirely bad episode. I think Borneo as a whole is just a pretty entertaining ride, but I do think this is probably the episode that stands out the least. Next, for Australian Outback, and I mean, I've been very open to this. It's obviously a post-merge episode. I mean, again, the pre-merge is okay on this season. The post-merge is definitely where it falters. And I think there's numerous episodes to consider here. You have episode 8, the episode after merge vote, where Alicia goes home. Again, a very predictable episode there. You have episode 10, where Nick goes home, which the only reason I didn't pick that was because of the auction. Episode 11, where Amber goes home, I didn't pick because at least there was the flood, and while it's not the stuff that I love to see on Survivor, it's at least something that's notable about the episode. Episode 13 was in consideration, the Final Four episode, as it's the Final Four episode, but at least had the reward with Colby and his mom that I found funny. I also very much considered the finale, which straight up, I did not end up going with the finale for any of the answers for this. And really something goes with the premieres, but again, I was so close, as I do think this is definitely the worst finale in this show's history, and definitely one of the worst episodes in the show's history. The reason I didn't go with it is because at least it does have Colby voting out Keith. And Final Tribal, even though this was not that great of one, is still like generally more entertaining than a lot of the boring camp life that we typically get. Even though, again, the first half of the episode is rough with so much focus on arts and crafts. So the pick I ended up going with here ends up being episode 12, Enough is Enough, the final 5 episode where Roger goes home, where, again, not much really happens this episode outside of the calls from home, which, again, that's like somewhat interesting, I guess, but even then, not particularly so. The only real interesting thing that comes out of it is Keith proposing to his girlfriend, adding to the Colby feud with him. But obviously just a very straightforward episode, and one where the boot throughout all of it was pretty predictable of Roger's laying down his sword. So again, not a particularly great episode there. Next up for Survivor Africa, and this one was a bit tough as I didn't really have many true considerations. For me, the only pre-merge episode that really stood out was episode 2, where Jesse Camacho goes home, which, again, is just kind of an okay episode, though there's a lot of setup to future dynamics that are interesting. So the answer I end up going with here is episode 11, The Big Adventure, the episode where Kim Powers goes home. Again, this is another one very similar to previous one we talked about, where the only thing really interesting here comes from not even really the videos from home, but the reward where they get to do the match game with their loved ones. Again, that's kind of interesting. Outside that, it's a pretty predictable boot. Kim Powers goes home, continuing a Pagonging, where, I mean, in comparison to a lot of the other post-merge episodes, I mean, the Frank boot at least has the auction. The following episode at least has T-Bird sowing doubt between Tom and Lex. Like, this episode doesn't really have a lot of anything, so again, that's why I went with this one. Next up for Survivor Marquesas, and this is one where, again, my only 2 answers were post-merge episodes. I feel like the pre-merge of Marquesas is pretty strong for the most part. I think the lead up to the Fall of the Road to 4 and the end game is pretty strong. Where it is pretty weak are kind of the mid-merge episodes. I would say the final 7, final 6 rounds in particular. However, even there, again, like, I feel like most episodes had something of note. However, the answer I'm going to go with here is episode 10, The Princess, the episode where Tammy goes home, which is obviously a predictable boot there, but even beyond that, we also get a lot of focus on Nalia and Pascal's trip on the cruise ship, and again, that's kind of boring, even though we do get a funny little moment afterwards of Nalia trying to offer everyone mints. But again, I think it is probably the slowest episode of the season. It's the one that, again, doesn't really have much extra really going for it, so again, it's my answer here. Next, for Survivor Thailand, and this one's obviously a bit rough. There's some pretty bad episodes here. In terms of the pre-merge episodes, I mean, episodes 2 through 4 are pretty rough. rough. Episode 2 is just kind of a boring one. Episode 3 obviously has the Ted and Gandia situation, though really outside that, it is a pretty strong episode actually, with the attack zone and the vote off of Jed, but obviously the Ted and Gandia stuff is a downer, and the same thing goes with episode 4, where Gandia eventually goes home. The only benefit there is the bye-bye Denver Diva moment, which is funny. Episode 8, Sleeping with the Enemy, is an episode that I thought was going to be the pick. It's an episode that I always constantly remember as the worst episode of the season, an episode that happens after the fake merge, where we get the final 9, where one of the Suchais is going home and wastes like half the episode on focusing on how sad they are, which is not entertaining. The reason I didn't pick it is because at least the first half does have some interesting dynamics with the groups now being together. So the answer I ended up going with here is episode 10, While the Cats Are Away, which is the Penny boot. Again, the episode after the merge episode, where not much is really happening and kind of a trend with some of these earlier seasons. Again, you do have Penny turning on Jake and her still getting voted out. Again, there's not really much of intrigue really happening here. So where again, like I just feel like all the other post-merge episodes have at least something notable about them. This one does. This one really doesn't. So again, it's my pick here. Next, for Survivor Amazon, and I've been pretty outspoken. I think the pre-merge is pretty bad, and through that, I really thought a pre-merge episode would be my pick here. Where again, episode 2 is pretty slow. We're outside the granola bar incident and some of Rob's commentary. It's not particularly great. Episode 4 is also pretty slow, though we do get a somewhat interesting vote off by the end of it. Episode 6 is also pretty slow, where we got a lot of focus on the Alex and Shauna relationship, which is like, who cares? But my answer here ends up going to a post-merge episode here. The only bad post-merge episode in my mind, and that is episode 8, Sleeping with the Enemy, the episode where Dave Johnson goes home, where, again, there's really not much really happening in this episode. I mean, we focused a lot on Dave Johnson trying to save himself, all for it to be for naught anyway. And it does feel like a massive outlier in the post-merge episodes, where, again, the post-merge of the season is obviously very, very strong. But this is just one that has really nothing truly going for it. That's the one I went with. Next for Pearl Islands, and obviously Pearl Islands is one of the best seasons of all time. There's not many bad episodes here. The only two that really came to mind for me were 2 post-merge episodes. Episode 9, which has the Rhino boot, which again is pretty much in line with Sleeping with the Enemy. I would say it's slightly better in the sense that there's a lot of setup to the Rupert vote in this one at least, so again, I didn't go with it here. So the one I did go with was episode 12, Would You Be My Brutus Today? The episode where Krista goes home, where again, this also feels like a bit of a lull in the season, where we just had the Rupert vote. We then also had the Great Lie episode, which is an all-time great episode. And the aftermath of that is that Krista just kind of predictably gets taken out when John and Co flip back. It's not a particularly interesting episode. The challenges here weren't particularly interesting. I feel like the only thing of note is obviously the regret from Sandra and Krista in voting with John and Burton, but outside that, again, not a particularly great episode. Next up for Survivor All-Stars, and boy oh boy, there's a good chunk to talk about here. I mean, obviously the post-merge of the season's pretty rough. While I do think the last couple episodes are fine, and obviously the merge episode's okay, the episodes in between, not particularly great. We also have episode 7, where Colby goes home, which that episode, like a good chunk of it's spent on the reward, where they're on the cruise ship, which that's really dull. However, the answer for me is by far episode 6, Outraged. The episode where Sue Hawk quits the game. Like, again, it's just a very icky episode. It's one where, like, you can very much tell production sided against Sue in this situation. They were kind of upset at Sue for quitting the game, and through that they spend a decent chunk of this episode kind of sinking her, like showing the people that were not supportive of her, getting a lot of Big Tom content and Kathy content, which was just not good to see. And just obviously the just general situation is one that is just not fun to watch. Obviously sympathize for Sue and all this, but it did not make for good TV. And again, it's just an episode I find extremely rough to watch. I do not want to watch this episode ever again. So again, it's my pick here. Now for Survivor Vanuatu, which is actually a pretty difficult one to pick an answer from here, having just rewatched Vanuatu. I do feel like every episode kind of has its moment to where none of these episodes are entirely bad, actually. Or I remember in the prep for making this video before I had done the rewatch, I did think about episode 6, the Lisa Boot episode, which I remembered for some reason being pretty mundane, but turns out it's actually a pretty good episode. Same thing with the Chad Boot episode. Another episode that, again, I remember being mundane, being part of this Pagong, but again, there's a lot of intrigue there, and Scout trying to flip the game and failing. Well, for me, the episodes that did end up being in consideration here are episodes 12 and 13, the 2 episodes after the Leanne boot, where again, that is where kind of get this more pagonging there. Though even then, again, there's this intrigue from Chris trying to play the middle and again, having some questionable play throughout all of it. And even through that, we still get a lot of arguing between Eliza and Twilight at points, and we obviously see this dilemma from Eliza. But for me, the answer I am going to go with here is still an episode that has some good in it, but is going to be episode 4. Now that's a reward, which is the episode where Brady goes home. And again, that kind of sums up the episode. I mean, again, there is some drama early on. Again, there is some fighting between the women after the Mia vote, where we see Eliza being upset at Lisa for flipping, and again, that is some pretty good content. Though outside that, again, it's a mostly mundane episode, again, just kind of average there, and continuing on the pagonging that was going on the men's side of things, and voting out all the younger men, to where while Brady, again, seems to be a competent player and tries to flip things around, it never really felt like it was going to happen, and again, just not as much intrigue from this episode, which is the reason why I picked that as the worst one here. Next for Palau, and Palau's an interesting season where I think the back half of the season is really, really strong. It's really the first few episodes that are pretty bad. And really, I mean, as we'll go through the seasons moving forward, that's kind of the way it is with a lot of these seasons, is that a lot of the worst episodes are kind of clumped together. And here at Palau, a lot of them are earlier on in the season, though I do think there's one post-merge episode that's not great, and that is Exile Island, the episode where Janu quits the game, though obviously it has Exile Island, so at least that's somewhat notable. Again, outside of that, really, a lot of the earlier episodes are pretty rough, especially the episodes before the Oolonging fully goes into place. So like the Ashley Ashby vote and the Jeff and Kim votes, because who cares about them? The one I am going with was episode 3, Creatures and Horrible Setbacks, the episode where Jeff Wilson essentially quits the game, tells people to vote him out because of his injury. Again, just kind of a whatever episode. To be honest, is it that much worse than the other two? Not really, but just the aspect of Jeff quitting the game, along with like nothing else of true note happening in this episode. Again, it was enough for me to pick it here. Next up for Survivor Guatemala, and this is a season that, again, has a few decent answers. Episode 7 was one that I very much considered the Amy O'Hara boot, considering that was just such a foregone conclusion, but I feel like at least that episode had the bizarre birthday party where Danny had the other tribe come to their tribe, and that was weird. We also have episode 11, Everything is Personal, the episode where Gary goes home, and again, not a great episode, but at least you do have some bickering between Gary and Judd, and obviously some scrambling from Gary. The episode I am going with was episode 3, The Brave May Not Live Long, but the Cautious Don't Live at All, which, what a title. I think this episode just simply is bad. I just think this episode, again, also has like very little intrigue in it. It's Brianna going home simply due to the challenge strength. Also, a lot of the dynamics on these individual tribes simply just don't matter, considering how really the swap dynamics end up really dominating the day anyway. So again, a lot of these segments with these individual tribes are just kind of pointless in the grand scheme of things as well. So again, like, I just feel like this is an episode that doesn't really have much going for it, so I ended up picking it here. Next for Panama, and for Panama, the episodes I'm going to be considering here are a lot of the post-merge episodes. I'm actually going to consider the finale, as I do feel like the finale is particularly slow. I mean, it is one where we do start off with the Suri fire making challenge, and after that we waste time on a reward challenge for Terry that doesn't end up mattering. But at the end of the day, again, like, there's still more stuff going on here, enough to not make it the pick. So really my two main considerations are episodes 9 to 10, the episodes after the merge episode, obviously being the Austin and the Sally votes. I decided to go with episode 9, Fight for Your Life or Eat, the Sally boot episode, where while the immunity challenge is somewhat notable in the fact that obviously Kasaya sits out of the immunity challenge, outside of that, I do feel like not much really happens this episode. I mean, Sally goes home pretty unceremoniously. I feel like episode 8 at least had a little bit more scrambling going on. It also had Austin trying to recover from his blunder in the previous episode, and again, I feel like there's at least like some more intrigue in that episode, while episode 9 really didn't have much, so again, I went with it here. Next for Cook Islands, and Cook Islands, I think, is a bit more scattered in terms of its bad episodes. I do think episode 13, the Parvati boot episode, is not particularly great, but at least it does have the reward where Parvati's in the hot tub, which ends up being kind of a notable scene at least. I also considered episode 5, the Stephanie boot episode, where outside of the aspect of her getting voted out due to her wanting mashed potatoes, like outside of that, nothing really of intrigue happens there. But instead, I decided to go with episode 7, Why Aren't You Swimming? The Flicka boot episode, as I really could not tell you a single thing that happened in this episode. I feel like it's an episode where not much really happens. It's also one where the Flicka boot was pretty predictable, and it's kind of also by the point where it felt like these tribe formations were going on for a bit too long before we obviously shake them up in the following episode with the mutiny. So again, I do feel like for me that is my pick here. Next up for Fiji, and Fiji is an interesting case here, as I do feel like some of the worst episodes are earlier on. I do think episodes like 2 and 3 in particular are pretty bad. And I think for me, when I think of Fiji, I do think of its weak pre-merge. However, I am actually going to go with a post-merge episode. And that is episode 12, A Smile, Violet Gloves, and a Dagger in My Pocket. Again, what a name. This is the Alex boot episode. And again, I think the post-merge of Fiji is pretty strong. I think this is the one outlier where this is just an episode where there's not much intrigue. Alex is going home. Everyone knows it. While he did do a move to save himself in the Mookie Boot episode, at this episode he really had no real chance of saving himself. And outside of a really close immunity challenge, there's really nothing of intrigue in this episode. So again, that's the one I went with. Next up for Survivor, China, and I feel like there's a couple episodes to consider here. Both of them are post-merge. I did consider episode 12, Going for the Oscar, the PG boot episode, where, again, it was just kind of predictable PG was going home. However, I did end up going with episode 9, Just Don't Eat the Apple, the Frosty boot episode, where, again, also just not much really happens in this episode. I feel like for me, the PG Amanda episode, at least there's like me remembering the PG Amanda dynamic and them building a relationship there. I really don't have much to say about episode 9. Again, Frosty, I think it was one of the more relevant players on the season. And with him being just outright on the bottom and getting voted out here again, it's not a particularly interesting result. So that's the one I picked. Next for Micronesia, and obviously Micronesia is a very, very strong episode. However, I do think it has a bit of a bad post-swap phase, and episode 6 and 7 are the main considerations for me. Episode 6 being the Chet quit, and also Penner getting medevaced, which, again, is rough, but at least there was like a chance of an Aussie blindside in that episode, and obviously you have the Penner medevac, which is very brutal. So I'm going to go with episode 7, like a wide-eyed kid in the candy store, where this does have a pretty notable moment, and that is the reward where Eric is amazed by all the nude women around him. And again, that's pretty funny. But outside of that, I mean, it's a rough episode. It's one where Kathy quits the game. And again, that is obviously not particularly fun. And then we follow that with a very straightforward Tracy vote, probably the most straightforward vote of the season, to where, again, it's just not a great episode. I do think outside the little character moment that's there, not really much of intrigue. So again, I went with it. Next for Gabon, and for me, Gabon's weakest point in the season is earlier on. I do think episodes like episode 2, the Paloma boot, is particularly weak. Episode 5, the Kelly Zarnecki vote, is also particularly weak. The answer I ended up going with is actually episode 4, This Camp is Cursed, which is the GC quit, which, again, I picked because it's GC quitting. Now, there are some interesting moments within this episode, as are of most Gabon episodes, but I just feel like, in general, this is the one that, like, stuck out the least to me, and I feel like the aspect of him quitting the game was a bit of a downer, to where that's the one I went with. Next for Tocantins, and once again, the worst episodes are early on. I think episode 2 is in consideration, though considering the great coach content in that episode, I decided to not go with it. Episode 5 I considered, where Spencer goes home, though I do think you have the notable moment of JT losing his tooth in the immunity challenge, so at least there's that. Episode 7, the Dragon Slayer, is an episode I consider, though, again, it has Coach dubbing himself the Dragon Slayer, and also technically it's the merge episode. The reason it's underwhelming is obviously because Joe gets medevaced, but I'll say that there's a lot of really interesting dynamics going on in that episode. So the one I end up going with here is actually episode 4, The Strongest Man Alive, the Sandy vote. Again, it's just the episode that stood out the least to me. I feel like there's not too much to really prop this one up for. I mean, I love Sandy as a character, but her boot here was pretty predictable, pretty much by the numbers, and in comparison to the other episodes, again, I feel like they each had at least something to note from it, while this one really didn't. So again, that's the one I went with. Next up for Samoa, and this is one with a few considerations. I mean, I think the only post-merge episode I consider was episode 13, the Shambo boot, which is a relatively weak episode for post-merge, but I feel like at least the Brett and Natalie relationship and how that upset Russell at least was something notable from it. So we're going back to the pre-merge then, where I do think there's a few rough episodes. Obviously, the entire saga with Ben, which is not great. I feel like those episodes had like other like decent stuff within it to not make them the pick. Really, the top 2 picks for me go to kind of straight up boring episodes. You got episode 7, the Liz vote, where, again, not much of intrigue is really happening there. It really feels like the merge is just really going on for a bit too long at that point. But I didn't go with that. Instead, I went with episode 5, Walking on Thin Ice, And the first half of this episode is just fine. I mean, it's just typical Survivor, but the back half of this episode is rough. And the reason for that is because it was raining so hard to where they literally had no footage of the players leaving the shelter, as they obviously didn't want to go out in the rain. So because that, the post-challenge scramble is literally just them in the shelter with us getting random confessionals cut in, which is all really lame. So again, that's a pretty notable sequence to me. And again, for all culminating, and then Ashley Trainer wrote off is also just kind of whatever. So again, I feel like that was the answer. Next up for Heroes vs. Villains. Obviously, Heroes vs. Villains is known as one of the best seasons of all time. I do agree. And because that, again, not many bad episodes here. I think the weaker episodes are probably episode 13, Rupert vote off, which again, pretty by the numbers there. I know other people claim that the post-merge is the weakest aspect of Heroes vs. Villains. However, I personally enjoy it. I don't really think any other episodes come into consideration here. But the answer I'm going to go with here as the worst episode is episode 5, Knights of the Round Table. Again, another one where like most episodes are great on this season. While like the Courtney vote off is not super notable, that episode as a whole does have Russell being given the idol. So at least there's that. Again, this episode doesn't really have much. It's Tom going home. It's a very predictable vote, especially after the previous idol play. Again, it's not an actual bad episode, but just in comparison to the rest on the season, it definitely feels like the weakest of the bunch. Next for Nicaragua, and obviously this season has a massive slow point, and that is after the Brenda boot, where after Brenda boot we also get the double quit, and after the double quit we get the gameplay slowing down significantly coming into the finale. And episodes 11, 12, 13 are the main contenders here. I decided to not go with episode 11, the double quit episode, mainly because I actually find that entertaining. I think there's good stuff in that episode. Again, it's a very unique episode, obviously, with Nyanka and Purple Kelly quitting, but again, that's something that we hadn't seen before. And mixing that with the fact that we get the Gulliver's Travels challenge, which is funny. I just felt like it wasn't going to be my pick. So because that, I was between episodes 12 and 13, the Ben reboot or the Jane boot. And I decided to go with episode 12. Not sure where I stand, the Ben reboot, where even though this is more of a contentious vote off where you're supposed to be like unsure where exactly Sash is going, I feel like it was kind of predictable where Sash was going. And mixing out the fact that, again, I think Jane boot has some decent content from Jane. You also get the family visit in that episode. This episode, again, really doesn't have much to it. It really feels like this episode that you are feeling the loss of Nyanka and really a lot of the other characters, where again, like this is a season where a lot of the big characters in Nyanka, Brenda, and Marty go out back to back to back. And when we're left with the feel that we're left with in this episode, you definitely start to feel it. All the big players are gone at this point, but so mixing that in, if again, a kind of lackluster result, I did end up picking it here. Next up for Redemption Island, this was a pretty easy answer for me. This is an episode that I've always remembered as an all-time bad one. Now, there are other bad episodes, like episodes 5 and 6, the Krista and Stephanie boots, where, again, just very predictable results there. Episodes 11 and 12 are particularly bad, where episode 11 finishes up the Pagonging on Onomatepe, while episode 12 is the Andrea boot, which is kind of predictable as well. However, I am going to go with what is in my mind one of the worst episodes in Survivor history, episode 10, Rice Wars, which is a particularly slow episode. I mean, like Redemption Island, as much as people criticize as it being this big Pagonging, the Pagonging for the most part is condensed to where, again, the episode before and the episode after this are double boot episodes. However, this is the only full episode that contains the Pagonging, which is obviously a factor into why this is so bad. But I think the main thing that also keeps it pretty bad is just kind of the ickiness surrounding some of this episode, where you do have this like feud between Steve and Philip, where Philip accuses Steve of being racist, and it's just, again, not particularly fun. Or I'm someone that, for the most part, I do actually enjoy Philip as a character, though I think this is a point in the season where it was a little bit rougher to watch. And mixing out, again, just the mundaneness of the Pagonging at this point, again, this was a definitive pick for me. Next up for South Pacific, and pretty much the same thing. I mean, South Pacific, same thing. The Pagonging here was pretty glossed over. However, episodes 10, 11, and 12 are the considerations for me. Episode 10 being the double boot where Whitney and Dawn go home, but again, at least it was a double boot, so at least there were things going on. Episodes 11 and 12 are a lot slower and are kind of this like secondary Pagonging. It's the Pagonging after the Pagonging where Cochran and Edna go home. I decided to go with the Cochran boot episode, episode 11, Cult-like, where I felt like with the Edna boot, there was at least a little bit more potential for Coach to decide to save Edna there. Also, you do have the Cochran versus Ozzy redemption duel. That was kind of interesting. And this episode doesn't really have that. I mean, this episode is, again, just Cochran going home pretty predictably, being on the bottom of his alliance. We have some fun from like Albert giving him his reward in a very clear attempt to gain favor with him, and we do get some fun content between him and Coach. But I mean, again, as a whole, a pretty mundane episode. Pretty much plays out exactly as you would expect it. So yeah, I think it's the worst here. Next up for One World, and One World's interesting as I do feel like there's a few considerations. I think it's one of the few seasons where the premiere is in consideration. I do think episode 1 is particularly rough, especially without a vote off. Episode 2 is also not particularly great, where Nina gets vote off, and outside of the interesting dynamic that comes from the World twist, I don't feel like much of intrigue really happens there. Episode 11, where Troyzan goes home, is a particularly rough episode, and that's definitely one that I very much considered here. However, the episode I did end up going with here is episode 6, Thanks for the Souvenir, the episode where Colton gets medevac from the game. And again, this is an episode that doesn't have much truly good about it. I mean, it has Colton getting medevaced, which through that means that we don't get a vote off. We also get some ickiness from Colton and Alicia's treatment of Christina, which is also not fun to watch. I think this is just an episode that's kind of void of fun, and while the Troyzan vote, again, is also pretty boring, at least that one has Troyzan, like, fighting super hard to try to stay in the game. This doesn't even have that, so again, I did go with this one instead. Next up for Philippines, and Philippines, I think, has a couple slower points this season. I think the post-swap is particularly dry, where episodes 5 and 6 are two of the weaker episodes. However, I think the episode I'm going to go with is a post-merge episode, and that is episode 13, Gouge My Eyes Out, which is the final 5 episode where Abby Maria gets voted out, where again, like, there's not really much going on here. I mean, Abby Maria is the clear vote off here, while there is some setup to the likes of Scoopin and Lisa flipping, and never really felt like that was a true possibility, especially considering Malcolm had an idol save Denise if he wanted to. I just think in terms of character stuff, outside of Abby and Denise's dynamic, there's really nothing really going on in comparison to, and some of the other weaker episodes, like the Carter Boot episode's also pretty weak, but at least there you have the family visit. Again, in episode 5, you have the Dawson situation. Episode 6, you have at least the somewhat potential of the vote flipping onto Penner. So again, I feel like there's more intrigue in those episodes than this one. That's why I went with this. Next for Cara Moen. And Cara Moen's one that, again, I did consider the finale. I think the finale is pretty rough. It's a pretty boring episode with only one round of gameplay. However, again, it's still a finale, which still kind of elevates it a little bit. So the rest of my contenders here are all pre-merge episodes. And I think they're all pretty rough, to be honest. I think episode 3, where Hope goes home, has very little intrigue there. The only reason I didn't pick it is because at least there's some drama with Shamar. Episode 4, same thing, though at least there you do have like Reynolds being this big underdog by that point. Obviously, people will probably talk about episode 5, the Brandon vote off episode, though I personally still find that really entertaining TV, even though it was not a great situation to happen. So really my main considerations here are the post-swap episodes, episodes 6 and 7. I think both of these are pretty weak. I end up going episode 7, Tubby Lunchbox, which is a funny confessional, but outside of that, not much of intrigue going on there. It's the Julia Boot episode. I mean, I think the little semblance of intrigue is the Corinne of it all, where we have our feud with Philip in this episode, though that doesn't really come to head yet, and really they just let Corinne get her way anyway. So I mean, again, it's a Julia Boot episode. It's like, what do you expect? There's not much interesting going on. Next up for Blood versus Water, and this one's a bit scattered in terms of the bad episodes in my mind. Really, I would consider both Laura Moret episodes. Episode 5, her first vote off, is not particularly interesting, but also episode 10, Big Bad Wolf, the episode where Sierra votes out her mom, is an episode that I found super rough when I initially watched it. And while like now it's become obviously meme worthy with the Sierra voting out her mom, it's still not a great episode in my mind. I also considered episode 7, the Laura B vote off, which is also pretty mundane, but at least there you have this is like Vetus underdog story. So the answer I end up going with here is episode 13, Out on a Limb, the episode before the finale where Hayden gets voted off. Again, just an episode where it's pretty predictable what's going to happen. I mean, at that point, Hayden and Sierra are clearly on the bottom. Sierra wins immunity. Hayden's going home. Outside of that, not much of real intrigue is happening. They do have them trying to convince Monica, but never felt like it was a possibility. So again, I just don't feel like there's anything to truly note from this episode. Next up for Cagayan, I've been very open to the fact that Cagayan is my favorite season. However, I think there's a lot of episodes that kind of share a similar quality. Now, I still think these are good episodes. I think these are better episodes than most of the worst episodes from other seasons, but they're still of the same level. Again, you got episode 2, the episode where Bryce Isaiah goes home, which ends up being just kind of an okay episode. Episode 3, where Jatia goes home, has always been an episode I've never particularly loved. Episode 5, where Alexis goes home, is probably one that most people will call out as one of the weaker episodes. However, I always personally loved Tony's lie about Jeremiah having an idol clue, which I always found really funny. Episode 9 is a relatively weak episode where Jeremiah goes home. I think there at least you have like Tony's bag of tricks. I think you have the courting of Jeffra. So the episode I'm going to go with here is episode 11, Havoc Tariq. The Tasha boot episode, where, again, at this point, it was pretty clear that Tony was going to flip back and vote out Tasha. Even beyond that, I mean, you do also have a pretty slow segment of the reward of Spencer, Cass, and Wu going to school. And while obviously some people will love this content as this great personal content for them, I find it boring. And again, while we get some fake drama about, oh, Cass wants to flip on Tony, it's never going to happen, is it? Especially when you have these big threats like Tasha and Spencer in the game. So I never thought this episode was particularly strong, and that's why I went with it here. Next up for Survivor, San Juan del Sur, and this has a few considerations. I think the post-merge for the most part is pretty strong. You do also have the Reed vote, which is very weak. Though at least there you also have Jeff's annoyance at the majority and calling off the reward challenge, which is funny. Episodes 5 and 6 are also pretty weak. The post-swap episodes where Kelly and Dale go home. However, my answer here is actually episode 7, the merge episode, $1 Million Decision, which, again, is not great, particularly because Julie quits the game, and through that obviously saps the season of a lot of its momentum there, even though thankfully it picks up the following episode. But even beyond that, I mean, it's an episode where typically the merge is pretty great due to you see these new dynamics forming, you see these groups coming together. The issue with this season is that they're obviously loved ones, and mixing that into the fact that a lot of loved ones have already been together, there's really not much new to get from this. So I think that kind of like loses a lot of the luster of it being the merge episode as well, to where I think it's kind of a double-edged thing of, and the merge itself is not that interesting, and we don't even get a proper vote off. So again, like for me, I just feel like this is the pretty definitive answer here. Next up for Survivor, Worlds Apart, and straight up, I didn't have any other contenders. I think Worlds Apart is a season that is actually consistently solid. I mean, people obviously don't like Worlds Apart for the most part. However, I personally enjoy it. I do think it's a mostly consistent season. I think the weakest episode of the bunch, though, is episode 3, Crazy is as Crazy Does. An episode where Nina goes home and there's not really much intrigue to it. It's pretty clear Nina's going home from the very beginning. The other tribes get okay content. We do get some arguing on the Blue Collar tribe with Dan Foley making an ass of himself. We also get the Max and Shring Dodo content from the White Collar tribe. So again, there's stuff going on, but still the overall Nina vote off is just pretty weak. So that's the one I went with here. Next up for Survivor, Cambodia, and Cambodia has a few answers. I mean, episode 4, the Jeff Varner boot, is pretty slow, kind of predictable, and outside of the fact that Wu voted for Abby Maria 2 times, it's not that interesting. Episode 9 is a pretty notorious episode. Kelly Wigglesworth blindside, where a lot of the storylines in that episode come out of nowhere, and I do agree. I do think it is a particularly bad episode in the grand scheme of things, though I do think as an individual episode, just watching it on its own, I don't think it's the worst episode in the world. So for me, the main 2 considerations here do come from pretty late in the season, episodes 12 and 13. I think the episodes right before the finale are kind of rough. However, the one I end up going with here is episode 12, Tiny Little Shanks to the Heart. The Joe boot episode, which is an episode that I personally found boring. I mean, we do get the family visit, and at least there's that. We do get this kind of culmination to Joe's storyline about wanting his dad to go out there. We also have the reappearance of Val and Dale, and that's kind of cool. But the family visit as a whole doesn't really do that much for me. Also, the immunity challenge, we end up spending a lot of time when like Joe passes out, and also not particularly interesting to me. And again, for Joe to get voted out here is also pretty predictable. And I always found the editing of it very strange. But Tribal Council, this episode in particular, is very choppy, where you could very much tell a lot of the reactions to things were out of place, and I don't even know what they were doing there. It's like I just don't like a lot of what this episode does, so I personally went with it. Next for Go Wrong, and this one has a few considerations. I mean, episode 7, the merge episode, is not the greatest, particularly due to the fact that Neil gets medevac, though outside of that, it's okay. Episode 11, the Julia boot episode, is also particularly weak, where that's kind of predictable, but my answer goes to episode 13, With Me or Not With Me, the episode where Joe gets medevac from the game, which is just really lame that we had the final 5 have a medevac. And when, again, it was already the final 5 round where not much is really going on, for to now even have it be a non-elimination to add to that is, again, particularly rough. I do think this is actually, to me, one of the worst episodes in Survivor history. I think it's just kind of a really boring episode, so it was a pretty easy answer for me. Next up, for Millennials versus Gen X, and I think this is a season that, again, the post-merge is really, really strong. The pre-merge is, I think, where I would consider more episodes. I would actually consider the premiere. I think the premiere is not the greatest, with the Rachel Aiko boot also not being great. Episode 3, the Paul Wachter boot, is also not particularly great, though at least it's more of a blindside there. The answer I end up going with here is episode 5, Idol Search Party, which ends up with the CC boot, which is kind of lame. Now, it is a swap episode, and typically swap episodes are better than most, though, again, I just feel like the fact that it culminates in a CC vote off. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think this is actually that bad of an episode. Like, I think as a whole, this season is just pretty strong. But yeah, I just feel like there's more notable moments from the individual episodes that aren't as good here, to where this just ends up being the one I pick. Next up, for Survivor, Game Changers, and I mean, what do you think? I did consider the Sandra Boot episode because I did consider that episode boring, but I mean, come on, the answer is episode 6. What happened on Exile stays on Exile, which obviously ends up being the episode where Varner outs Zeke. Not a fun episode in the slightest, just really brutal TV, not something I particularly want to watch ever again. I don't feel like this was entertaining in the slightest. And now knowing obviously Jeff Varner post this season as well, it certainly has not helped. As at least if this was an instance of Varner having learned something through all this, at least it could mean something. But no, Varner's still who he is, and this episode just all around just very brutal to watch. Easily one of the worst episodes in Survivor history, and easily my pick here. Next for HHH, and really all my considerations here were pre-merge, and just in general, I think this season gets to a pretty rough start. I did consider episode 6 the alley boot, simply because, and by that point, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion, though I think there was at least some interesting drama between Allie and Ryan. Outside of that, though, my main considerations were episodes 1, 2, and 3, where this was a pretty rough premiere. I mean, they only gave them 60 minutes, and there's just so much to cram in. Now, at the end of the day, there were still some good moments. I mean, Alan Ball strip searching JP is still super funny, but the main consideration does end up being between episodes 2 and 3. I decided to go to episode 3. My kisses are very private. The Patrick boot episode, as I just felt like the Patrick boot was so obvious at this point, where at least the previous episode there was at least more suspense between Patrick or Simone. Though I think another aspect of this episode I don't love is the amount of focus on Cole and Jessica, where their showmance takes a major focus as well, which is like, who cares? So again, I do feel like for me, this ended up being a kind of easy answer, even though I personally do really enjoy the Patrick vote off and him staring daggers on his way out. Anyway, now for Ghost Island, and this is one where I have a pretty easy answer for me personally. I don't think most people agree. Now, I do think there are some weaker episodes, like episode 12, Kellen gets voted out, which isn't particularly interesting. Episode 5, where James Lim gets voted out, is also pretty boring, but my answer has always been episode 4, A Diamond in the Rough, the episode where Stephanie Johnson gets voted out of the game, which I just always personally found boring. I know why people like this episode, as some people do enjoy the amount of focus on the human aspect of it all, and how we get focused on all 3 of the potential boots here, and how this would be devastating for them to go out here. But again, I just found it boring, and I just find the overall result just so predictable here. I thought Stephanie Johnson getting voted out was the pretty obvious results, and again, like, I just did not find this episode entertaining in the slightest for me personally. But again, it ends up being my pick here. Next up for David vs. Goliath, and David vs. Goliath is obviously a great season, and I really don't think there is a truly terrible episode of the bunch. However, there's only one episode that really comes to my mind as an episode that isn't that great, and that episode is episode 6, Aren't Burchados Just Adorable? The Lirsa boot episode, where, again, I think every other episode is actually pretty good to obviously great, to where this is the only episode that sticks out as one that isn't good. Now again, is it better than most of the other picks from other seasons? Probably. But it is a pretty ho-hum episode. Again, Lirsa getting voted out is pretty predictable. Not much intrigue in this episode outside of just the talk about the brochachos, which even then isn't that entertaining. So again, easily my pick. Next up for Edge of Extinction. The contenders for this season are kind of all over the place. I do think episode 2 is one of the weaker episodes of the bunch, the episode where Keith goes home, but I still feel like there's at least enough dynamic stuff going on in that episode to where it didn't end up being my pick. Episode 12, the Aurora boot episode, was also particularly weak in my mind. Though I think there at least you have like Rick going all out and him threatening using his idol on Julie. So the one that I'm personally going to go with here is episode 7, which is the Eric blindside episode, which is a decent blindside. I think this kind of has this very similar issue to the Kella Wigglesworth episode from Cambodia that we talked about earlier, in the fact that the editing of this episode is just very weird and very all over the place, to where again, just the overall concurrent storyline of the season is just a bit weird, where really up to this point we had gotten a lot of talk about how Eric and Gavin are ride or dies, only for it to turn out in this episode that they're not ride or dies, and Gavin's voting out Eric, and Eric is super close to Ron and Julie out of nowhere. And just overall, again, like the overall dynamics of how this vote plays out are bizarre and aren't really properly explained, and really it's things like that do end up being pretty major issues for this episode, where, well, again, I don't think this would be my pick as the worst episode if it was on certain other seasons. I do think for this season in particular, this definitely screams out as the weakest of the bunch. Next up for IOI, and obviously there's a super obvious answer, but I did also consider episode 5, the Tom boot episode, as that one's pretty lackluster, but come on, it's the merge episode. Episode 8, we made it to the merge, where, I mean, truth be told, the first half of the episode's not entirely bad. Well, obviously, this is a 2-hour episode. The first half, obviously, involving the Kelly Kim vote off, which the vote off itself is pretty strong if you take out Dan Spilo cheering in the background. But again, for someone to get voted out in a really tight vote with 2 idols in their pocket is a pretty great result. But it's obviously the second half of the episode that just completely sinks everything. I think the second hour of this episode is probably one of the worst hours of Survivor in Survivor history. I mean, you obviously get so much focus on Dan Spilo and so much focus on how people are handling the Dan Spilo situation, from the likes of Missy and Elizabeth, who lie about Dan not bothering them, to Janet being ostracized due to the fact that she stood up for the women that were calling out Dan Spilo. You have the likes of Aaron supporting Dan, which isn't particularly great. You just get so much focus on Dan earlier on in the episode, and then you also get a lot of focus in that tribal, where, and Jeff does call him out, but it's just really icky for them to even still leave him in the game at this point. And beyond that, I mean, you also have Jamal just getting massively screwed over here by him finding an advantage, only for it to turn out the advantage is that he loses his vote, and that he now can give someone else a fake advantage, which is all stupid. And again, like, this is a terrible second hour of television, where while the first half is okay, the second half is brutal, and because of that, for me, it is my pick here. Now we're at Winners at War, and this is another one where the potential episodes here are kind of all over the place. I did consider episode 4, the first Tyson boot episode, as, again, I just feel like it's an episode where not much is truly happening there, though I feel like you do have, like, Boston and Parvati recovering for a little bit, to where, like, that's enough to not make it my pick. I did also consider episode 13, the penultimate step of the war, obviously the penultimate episode of the season. Another 2-hour episode where Jeremy and Nick go home, which is also not the greatest episode in the world. Kind of a point where the season kind of slows down a bit, but the episode I end up going with here is episode 7, We're in the Majors, the Yule boot episode, which is just kind of lame. Kind of disappointing to see Yule get taken out right before the merge, in a situation where he gets kind of screwed over by the fact that all of his allies are on the same tribe together, and he obviously just didn't have as much of a pregame relationship with them. Even beyond that, I don't feel like there's that much of intrigue going on, and again, it's just an episode that I remember just being really disappointed by the result when it originally aired, to where I made it my pick here. Now we're in a new era. We're starting off with Survivor 41, and this one has a very easy answer. There's other pretty mediocre post-merge episodes. You got episode 8, where Tiffany goes home, which is kind of ho-hum. Episode 11 is Do or Die, and that's a pretty bad episode. Episode 12 is the Danny boot, which is pretty weak outside of the fact that Deshaun tries to throw some truth bombs at the end. But my answer is always going to be episode 6, Ready to Play Like a Lion, the non-elimination Hourglass episode, part 1 of the merge, where, again, there are some interesting dynamics being set up with the merge, but outside of that, obviously it doesn't culminate in anything because it's only part 1 of an episode, and especially when the culmination is this dilemma on, is Erica going to use the Hourglass or not? It's like, what do you think? It's, again, really bad episode in my mind. Definitely one of the lesser episodes in Survivor history in my mind, so because that was an easy pick. But with that, we get to Survivor 42, where really from this point forward, it does feel like a lot of the worst episodes for Survivor end up being earlier on. It feels like the pre-merge is simply not that interesting, because 3-tribe format with very little options isn't that interesting. But anyway, I had other contenders, and 42 in particular, I had more contenders from the post-merge. Episode 8, the Chanel boot, was definitely in consideration. Episode 10, the High boot, was also in consideration. But the answer for me is pretty definitively episode 2, Good and Guilt, the episode where Mariah goes home, which was just not interesting in the slightest. Again, there was still some interesting dynamics being set up, but outside of that, just kind of a lackluster episode with a really boring result. So again, easily my pick there. And the same thing goes for Survivor 43, where really only 2 episodes like truly came to mind for me. Episode 8 was one that did the Janine boot, which was just kind of a frustrating episode to watch. But my answer here is episode 3. I'll sign the divorce papers, the Nneka boot, where, again, it's kind of boring. Just don't really feel like much of substance really happens here. Nneka going home was pretty predictable. Outside of that, nothing really notable happens in the episode. And again, I just found that extremely boring at the time that aired, so it was my pick here. Next for Survivor 44. And while there's a pretty late episode in episode 12 that I did very much consider, the Jamie boot episode, my main contenders were episodes 2 and 3. I think both of them are pretty weak. I ended up going to episode 2, 2 dorky magnets, to where while we do get the setup of the Matt and Franny relationship, outside of that, not much really great happens here. The vote off is pretty predictable, and Helen going home, much more so than the Claire vote. So I feel like that was the reason why I picked this one over the other one. Also, both episodes ended up focusing on the idol hunt and the birdcage, to where while this one might be stronger, and this being the one where Carolyn finds her idol, I still feel like the overall vote off was just way more lackluster. So because that was my pick here. Now for Survivor 45, where for me, I feel like this one actually has a pretty easy answer, to where while I do feel like episode 5, the Brando vote off, was not particularly great, with the editing feeling like a downgrade for the rest of the season, while episode 10, How Am I a Mobster, was a bit of inconsistent, where while there was some fun from the Bruce blind side, and the fight between Jake and Drew, really a lot of the rest of the episode was, again, kind of sappy, and the Bruce vote off was pretty foreshown. However, I think for me, the easy answer here is episode 9, Sword of Damocles, the episode where Kendra gets voted out here, which again just felt like the most new era episode of the season, the one where they have the mega challenge, and that's followed out with the new twist where they're split into 3 groups, and one of the groups loses their vote and have to earn it back. And really, for me, I think this was actually a pretty bad episode, where really I feel like the rest of the season is pretty consistently fine, where even the bad episodes I just mentioned there are not even that bad. This is actually a genuinely bad episode, especially when mixing this with the fact that we get a very obvious Kendra vote off, and really just like not much of note really happens here. Or again, just so much focus around this really long challenge, and the groups being separated, with them not really being able to do anything considering they're separated, and then also the challenge to get their vote back. It's all just really mundane. So again, that is easily my pick here. Now for the latest finished season of the show, we got Survivor 46, and I mean, Survivor 46 is obviously a season that is pretty known for having a pretty bad start to the season. First straight up, all my contenders here were in the first half of the season, where really I feel like all of episodes 2, 3, and 4 are definitely in consideration. Just a pretty mundane portion of the season, to where I'm sure it works better on the rewatch when you don't have to wait a week between episodes. But again, just seeing this like really delayed extermination of the Yanus was just simply just not that interesting to see, especially when these episodes were, again, obviously 2 hours to 90 minutes each. And again, obviously us getting so much of Banu obviously also factored in here. Though I'll say another episode that was in consideration for me was actually the Murgatory episode, episode 6, which again, I thought was a pretty lackluster Murgatory episode with very little intrigue there. But for me, I am still going to go with one of those earlier episodes. And again, like I think all 3 of them have reasons to pick them. Episode 2 is again a 2-hour episode with so much filler in it. Though despite that, again, I think the just elimination with fake idol situation occurring with it, like at least that was somewhat interesting. Episode 3 is an episode that doesn't even have a formal elimination. Again, Randy gets medevaced in that episode. However, again, a pro for that episode is the fact that I just absolutely love the journey sequence. It's one of my favorite scenes of the entire season of Banu's meltdown. So the episode I'm actually going to pick here is episode 4, Don't Touch the Oven, the actual eventual Banu boot episode, where again, there's just nothing really happening in this episode. It was just the second episode in a row where it was so clear that Banu was going home, and it really just felt like an inevitability, to where, I mean, outside of that, we do get some intrigue from like Jem rehiding the Beware Vantage, and Tevin trying to flip the vote on Soda. But again, for me, it's not really enough to really elevate this episode. But again, most of the content on Yanu was just simply not that interesting to me. Though I will say I do like the sequence before Tribal, where again has Banu going through stages of grief, and again that is interesting. But overall, again, just part 2 of this really delayed execution for Banu, to where at least at the time that this was pretty miserable to watch. So for me, again, it's my pick here. But again, there we go. I mean, that is the worst episode for every season of Survivor US. Now down the road, obviously I'll continue to do videos like this because that's just what I do. So stay tuned for them for whenever they come. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.